Bonjour tout le monde et bienvenue au congrès annuel de la Société canadienne d'Ophthalmologie. Good morning, everyone. As chair of this U.S. annual meeting, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to Halifax and to the 2022 edition of this U.S. annual meeting. We are here lighting the way for eye care in Canada. I'm thrilled to reconvene in person and thank you all for joining us. The excellence of our scientific program and those who participate in its creation and execution is second to none in Canada. As such, the meeting has grown into the largest gathering of ophthalmologists and eye care professionals in this country. This year's meeting feels like la renaissance, a rebirth, with an effort to revive and surpass all our achievements and ideas after these 2 years in a virtual world. Sincere thanks to the annual meeting planning committee for the tireless work organizing sessions, inviting speakers, reviewing abstracts. All this effort and more allows us to successfully pull together this meeting. To that end, I would like to thank each session chair for delivering exceptional programming for their sessions and offering more diversity than ever before. We have Section 3 accredited simulation courses and self-assessment programs under the leadership of Dr. Patrick Goey. We have Section 2 accredited e-posters and videos for on-demand viewing, and Section 1 accredited sessions taking place over the next 3 days. Many thanks also to the adjudicators and their wonderful leader, Dr. Cindy Hotnick. To our keynote speakers, thank you for your contribution to the success of this meeting and sharing your renowned expertise in ophthalmology. Thanks also to our industry partners and sponsors. Your support of this U.S. annual meeting and ophthalmology in Canada is so valuable and so much appreciated. We encourage all delegates to visit our exhibition hall and to connect with partners over the breaks to learn about the new developments and innovations. Finally, a great big thank you to the whole COS team and to our outstanding CPD director, Cheryl Ripley. It's her last meeting with us this year. Again, welcome to COS and to Halifax. So in addition to the scientific program, I really hope you get a chance to experience East Coast hospitality while reconnecting with your colleagues. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to launch Current Concepts 1, a first this year, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, a new addition to this U.S. annual meeting program, under the direction of Dr. Nupura Bakshi. I'm very pleased to introduce our first keynote speaker for EDI, Dr. Anderson, who will speak to us about racism outside and inside our walls. You can also attend the session this afternoon at 3:45 to hear more of our talks. Dr. Anderson practices both internal medicine and public health as Medical Officer of Health with Indigenous Services Canada. In 2018, she was named among the top 100 most powerful women in Canada. Recently, Dr. Anderson received the Royal College Indigenous Health Award. Welcome, Dr. Anderson.
Thank you for having me. As was mentioned, I practice in internal medicine and in public health, and I'm the Vice Dean for Indigenous Health, Anti-Racism, and Social Justice at the Rady Faculty of Health Sciences at University of Manitoba. I do not have any expert knowledge in ophthalmology to share with you today. In fact, I have so little that the first time I realized there was 2 L's in ophthalmology was in getting ready for this talk. It's great to be on site and on Mi'kma'ki here. I also do want to acknowledge the history of peoples of African descent on this land, which goes back to the 16th century. This place, that history, as well as the recent report of the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Nova Scotia examining systemic anti-Black racism, led me for this 10-minute talk to focus on systemic anti-Black racism in healthcare. I want to acknowledge some of my colleagues, including Dr. Delia Douglas, Dr. Anya Norum, Dr. Omashur Dryden, Dr. Kamara Jones, the Black Physicians Association of Canada, and the Black Medical Students Association of Canada as people who have contributed to my learning and who are friends and colleagues. So over the next several minutes, I'm going to very briefly describe how racism operates within healthcare in parallel ways to how racism operates in other settings, and then also end with a framework for how we can move forward from supportive statements to anti-racist action. Now, the quotes on this page are from the United Nations report of the Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent on its mission to Canada in 2017. And the reason why anti-Black racism operates in parallel ways across systems, including justice, education, employment, housing, and healthcare, is because of its common root in slavery and in the legacy of slavery. Now, my colleagues, Dr. Dryden and Dr. Norum, published a paper in the CMAJ in January of 2021, and in that they say, myths and stereotypes recreated and used to justify slavery and the torture of enslaved African people, including the idea that Black people were biologically inferior, different or subhuman, less intelligent, had a greater tolerance for pain, and were not to be trusted, among many other stereotypes. Now, as I read that quote, perhaps you yourself can imagine some of the ways this shows up in healthcare. The biologically different explanation was used as the justification for the 40-year Tuskegee experimentation, an incredibly unethical experiment. The greater tolerance to pain is often used as a reason for withholding pain treatment or providing less pain treatment. I'm going to talk about that a bit later. And in the last couple years, even medical students were still saying that they had been taught or believed that Black people had fewer pain receptors than other people. The not to be trusted is one of the common underlying beliefs that lead to our assessments of people as more likely to be non-compliant. In the College of Physicians from the Inside report, and I want you to keep in mind how hard it is for us as physicians generally to acknowledge what we don't know, but in that report, 58% of physicians in Nova Scotia said they had insufficient knowledge about anti-Black racism to identify any challenges within their own organization. And I'll just draw your attention to that yellow highlighted portion. Slavery existed in Canada from the 16th century until its abolition in 1834. Very commonly, we have this view in Canada that slavery didn't happen here, that we were actually the racism-free utopian endpoint of the Underground Railroad. However, we have our own several century history of slavery, and we continue to experience the impacts of that today. Now, that not knowing about our history, the denialism or minimization of anti-Black racism in Canada in comparison to the United States is one of the reasons why it has been rendered invisible here, why we have not yet wrestled with it to the extent that we need to. And yet, Andrew Loku, Jermaine Carby, Alex Wetlaufer, Kwasi Skeen-Peters, Jean-Pierre Boney, Ian Price, Frank Anthony Berry, Michael Elegon, Eric Osawe, Rayal Jardine Douglas, Junior Alexander Manon. Those were all people of African descent killed by police in Canada between 2010 and 2017, far before the killing of George Floyd. History informs anti-Black racism and racial stereotypes that are so deeply entrenched in institutions, policies, and practice that its institutional and systemic forms are functionally normalized or rendered invisible, especially to the dominant group. So I now want to move over and talk a bit about how this shows up in healthcare in parallel ways. Now, one example I provided already was that idea that Black people feel less pain. And so the chart there you can see is labeled moderate pain and severe pain. And this is looking at the administration of analgesia to people with appendicitis, an objectively painful condition, acute surgical condition. So what you can see there in that top chart in people who have moderate pain is how significant the difference is in administration of either any pain control or opioid pain control. And I'll just point out, you probably all know this better than I do, but for this acute surgical condition, opioid analgesics would be an entirely appropriate treatment. And then if you look at people who have severe pain, Black people slightly more likely to receive any analgesia, so that would include things like acetaminophen or ibuprofen, and far, far less likely to receive opioids. And again, that being an appropriate treatment. Now, the one thing that I didn't mention in this multi-center study of people presenting with appendicitis is this is actually in children. And I think it is really critical that we understand that our racist ideas translate into how we treat children as well. The other portion of the slide is from the recent Registered Nurses Association of Ontario report on anti-Black racism. And it is critical that we understand this also impacts our colleagues. And in fact, in that study, 89% of Black nurses reported experiences of racial bias or discrimination in the workplace. And the most common answers for how comfortable do you feel in your workplace were uncomfortable or very uncomfortable. In this recently published study of surgeons and anesthesiologists examining the prevalence and impact of sexist and racial microaggressions, which I will just pause and say, micro doesn't mean minor. It means it occurs between individuals in a system framework as opposed to meso or macro. In this study, 91% of female surgeons experienced sexist microaggressions, and 84% of racial or ethnic physicians, so physicians who are not white, experienced racial microaggressions. That is an incredibly high prevalence, and as you can see in this table, it contributes to higher levels of burnout. And so as we think about the current state of our healthcare system and the higher levels of burnout, I just want to encourage us not to approach that in colorblind ways, and really take this as our imperative to meaningfully disrupt racism in our system now. This is a model I developed about my current best thinking of anti-racism, and I'm just going to summarize it quickly. We'll go more in depth this afternoon. One key point is that racism is not static. It's not a fixed bar or ribbon we have to cross and then the work will be done. It is constantly evolving to achieve its goals, and that is, in this frame, I've referred to as the status quo. And so our anti-racist change has to be equally pervasive and evolutionary and innovative. The top cycles are from the Dalai Lama's book on the art of happiness, and it refers to a personal growth cycle where ultimately we move from learning to action and sustained effort. Now, when you think about how decisions get made in organizations, how culture change happens, what I would say is we need to be recruiting more and more of our colleagues, building coalitions to tip the balance in favor of persistent and sustained anti-racist action. So I hope you will join us for more discussions of that this afternoon. Takoyas and Padamya, thank you for having me. And I believe we have a few questions, or time for a few questions. Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions for Dr. Anderson? I have one.
Okay.
I would like to know if, and this is a huge topic, what do you think the first step should be for a physician who's committed towards anti-racist action and, showing that up in their place of work?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Thank you for starting us off there. And of course, I'll point to the very top circle there, which is learning. There is a ton of resources out there that we can be using to educate ourselves. I would also really encourage people to engage with the arts as part of that learning, as opposed to just journal articles and nonfiction books, because they engage our learning in a different ways. And then I would look to form groups, coalitions, whether that starts with a few people and grows over time, so that you can support each other in translating what you're learning into action. And the first action, I would say, when we think about how pervasive racism is, as both those studies showed, would be to take responsibility for interrupting and marking as inappropriate when we see that casual, everyday racism occurring in our workplaces.
Thank you. Thank you, and looking forward to the session this afternoon.
Our next talk is Clinical Pathological Correlations of Advanced Corneal Microsurgical Techniques by Dr. Dubois.